Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Fall Minnesota Peace Initiative. I hope you've all had a fabulous Thanksgiving, and hopefully you have recovered from your giant turkey feast. And tonight, we have a feast of another kind, a feast of ideas. Our topic tonight is, Our Water is Sick and Getting Sicker. For any of you attending for the first time, let me take a moment to tell you who we are and why we do these programs. The Minnesota Peace Initiative is part of the Norway House. Norway has a long tradition as a global peacemaker. As part of the Norway House, we seek to provide a forum for thoughtful discussions of current issues and conflicts. We bring you experts to share their knowledge and their insights so that you can become better informed about important, timely topics. For those of you who have attended in the past, you're probably asking yourself or wondering, what prompted us to do a program on water quality when there are so many hot spots in the world today? North Korea, Yemen, Saudi Arabia? Well, that's a very good question. Because we are living in a world of political tweets and the 24-hour news cycle, where something that happened last week seems like it's old news, we decided to pick a topic that is very serious, that gets worse day by day, and that is getting very little attention because of our focus on the scandal of the day. We chose water quality because it affects all of us, and because if we do not do something about it, it will lead to issues of war and peace. But I also want to say water quality is a timely issue. Just this morning, NPR was reporting that Africa's Lake Victoria is nearly dead from pollution. So, severe ramifications of water quality are already here. We will begin our program with Tom Hansen, a member of our committee and a past panelist, who will introduce our subject and our speakers. Following the introduction of our speakers, each of them will give opening remarks, and following that, I will lead a panel discussion of some of the more important facets of the topic. We will conclude with audience Q&A. So your questions are very important to the success of our programs. And so cards will be handed out to you and pencils, and we encourage all of you to write your questions, and we will gather the questions throughout the program, and then I will try to get to as many of your questions as is possible. I also want to acknowledge some guests that we have in our audience. Carol Ingebrigtsen Byrne, who is the president of Global Minnesota, is here. And Joe Underhill, who's the new director of the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, is here. I don't know, if you're both here, could you stand? Joel told me he was going to hide in the back, so. We welcome them as our guests because one of the things we are doing at the Minnesota Peace Initiative is also trying to build alliances with other organizations that are working on peace or current event issues, deeper knowledge of what's going on in the world. So it's important that they're here. We also, because of our particular topic, have a number of representatives from environmental organizations here in Minnesota. So we welcome them as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tom Hansen. Tom is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, whose diplomatic postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Tom currently serves as diplomat in residence at the Allworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. Tom is very active in many international organizations, and he speaks extensively throughout the world on topics of diplomacy and international relations. In fact, every time I try to call Tom or send him an email, I get a response from yet another exotic part of the world. So I have to tell you, Tom's life is one to be envied, as are his frequent flyer miles. With that, I'm glad to turn the podium over to Tom.
Well, thank you so much, Janet. And I want to thank the Minnesota Peace Initiative for bringing us together tonight to discuss a topic that I think is one of the most essential that's out there right now. It's interwoven with almost all the key issues today of war and peace, struggle over water as a limited commodity, climate change, the future of the planet, how this vast human population is going to survive as it moves toward 12 billion people toward the end of the century. I especially want to welcome tonight those of you in the audience who are working on these issues from the grassroots. What you're doing is essential, especially during this period, and so I'm very happy that we have so many of you with us tonight. So before I introduce the three speakers, I just want to offer a few reflections on the general issue of water. It's a vast topic. In fact, I sometimes think that it is so vast, so primal, so interwoven into all of these issues that we almost don't see it. We focus on oil, for example, or on disputes over land, the kind of the old causes of conflict. But this larger issue of oil, of water, is emerging now as a driver of the 21st century. So I'm very happy we're going to be talking about it tonight. Joseph Campbell, the famous expert on myth, said at one point that almost every mythology in human history sees the origins of life as coming out of water. And as he said, curiously enough, they were right. That is how it, and if you look even in Genesis, the beginning of the Judeo-Christian tradition, on the first day of creation, when all is void, all is empty, the Spirit of God moves over the waters before light is created. It's that primal. And of course, that's the way it is. 60% of our bodies are water. For babies, 75%. 71% roughly of the Earth's surface is water. Most of this resides in ice caps, glaciers, and permanent snow. Only 30% of it is in groundwater. And 96.5% of all the water is in oceans, bays, and seas. Only 3.5% is freshwater. That's a very thin margin. It's like that thin margin of the atmosphere from space. So the water issue is one that is ubiquitous but also fragile when you take a closer look. Now, I believe that we here in Minnesota, obviously, we're very blessed by our geography, by where we live. There's an abundance of water here. That can be a positive, but it can be a negative in terms of really wrapping our minds around this issue. Occasionally, we'll see droughts in California, the water scandal in Flint, Michigan, inundations in Houston, and we get a sense of what the rest of the world sees. But at this time, 1.1 billion people lack safe drinking water out in the world. 2.6 billion people lack adequate sanitation. And this is a huge human rights issue. In fact, the UN in 2010 passed a resolution declaring that there's a human right to water and sanitation, and that these issues are essential to the realization of all other human rights. They are the first right that is necessary. At the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals adopted a couple of years ago have now two main focuses on water, clean water and sanitation, but also life below water. And our discussion tonight will be touching on the pollution of the seas and how life is being affected. Now, the current crisis in water has a lot of causes. Population growth, of course, is one. In 1945, we were 2 billion on this planet. We were just passing 7.5, heading toward between 11 and 12. This is going to put tremendous stress on water resources. Also, changes in dietary habits, especially in China, are having a big impact on water. People are eating red meat in a way they didn't before. And it's estimated that for every 1 pound of beef that's produced, you need 2,400 gallons of water. It's very, very water intensive. And as the rest of the world develops, wants to live the way we do, which is their right, the stresses are going to increase. We'll be talking a lot tonight about pollution of the oceans. A distinction is made between what they call point source pollution. Now that is what we see on the news. Oil spills, chemical disasters, things that you can wrap your mind around and that fit the news cycle. That's point source pollution. But by far the larger source of the pollution, up to 80% of pollution of our waters, is non-point source pollution. Runoff from farms, basically what we do on land in all of our walks of life, running off into the waters. And in this case, the degree of concentration that enters the waters, for example, of fertilizers, is key because it produces algae, which can choke off life in a marine environment. Probably the most visible icon right now of this kind of pollution involves plastics. We've all heard about the plastic islands that are floating out in the oceans. The first plastic bags were introduced only in the 1950s. It's kind of hard to believe how recent this is, and plastic packaging. This is coming on so fast, the past 60 years, this kind of pollution, and it's likely to double over the next 10 to 15 years. Today, 1/4 of all fish purchased in our markets have plastic in them, at least in the US and Indonesia. 90% of seabirds consume them. The top 5 plastic polluters in the world today are all in Asia. They are China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. But we too are culpable in this through littering, not so much policy, but littering. And that brings me to my final point. How do we get at this problem? As I say, it's wonderful that we have the grassroots initiatives that are taking place, but it's going to take national and international policy and cooperation to get a handle on this all-encompassing issue. In my view, and the view of many experts, the U.S. has lacked a coherent national and international water policy. The UN Clean Seas Initiative of recent years, we are not a member. Law of the Sea Convention, we never signed. And we're sending mixed signals as our political environment shifts back and forth here. In 2010, we set up a national ocean policy implementation plan. June is now National Ocean Month. But in the most recent announcement of that month, we are talking more about the underutilized nature of our waters and seas, that we should extract more. The tone has shifted. So as we go back and forth as a nation, we're part of a larger problem. How do you square national sovereignty, which is what the world is all about? It's a world of nation states, with global challenges. How do you square that circle? The Paris Climate Accord is not binding, unfortunately. And if anything, right now, the trend in the world is toward greater bilateralism in a lot of areas. So the need for public awareness on these issues has never been greater. And that's why I so welcome tonight's program. And we have 3 real experts with us tonight. And I'd like to invite them to take the stage right now. First, Geir Wing Gabrielsen, from the Norwegian Polar Institute, an expert on ecotoxicology research. Geir, if you'd come up, please, welcome. Thanks for coming all this way to be with us tonight. Our second speaker, Dr. John Downing, who is the director of the Sea Grant College Program, professor of biology at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. John, welcome. And finally, Nancy Wallace, who is director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Marine Debris Program, which will be a major topic tonight. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. So we'd like each speaker to give a short introduction and come here to the podium. And when each is finished, I will invite Janet back up to begin the question and answer. So, Geir, if you'd set things off. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to come here and give a presentation about plastic pollution in the Arctic. I have been working in the Arctic for 36 years, and I have seen the development of plastic pollution, and it is quite a dramatic increase in the problem of plastic in the Arctic. And first, I want to show you this figure and give you some numbers with regard to plastic production. We are now up to something around 450 million tons of production of plastic. And in order to produce 1 kilo of plastic, there is 2 kilos of oil which is used. 8 to 10% of the oil production is used to plastic production today. And in '96, we used 2 kilos of plastic per year, every one of us. And in 2017, every person used 43 kilos of plastic per year. Packaging is the one which is increasing most. It has increased during a period of 5 to 7 years from 17% to 35% of the total plastic production. Wrapping material constitutes the value of $2,300 billion per year. And the prognosis for 2050 is a doubling of this plastic production. As you can see, it is in the east where you have the highest production of plastic. It is in China, in Japan, and in Asia. In Europe and in US, it is around 20% production of plastic. Of the plastic being produced and so on, we see that 14% of the plastic is recirculated, and it's 9% in US. 14% is burned and transformed to fuel and other products, while 40% is deposited and stored in landfilling. 32% is lost to the environment, quite high number, and this is from the World Economic Forum report. It is said that 8 to 12 million tons of plastic is going to the sea. And in a recent publication which has been made, it's saying that the rivers, the 10 biggest rivers in the world, they are really contributed to 90% of the plastic going to the sea. On microplastic, it's something around 1 million tons of plastic which is going to the sea, and a lot of the plastic is ending on the water bottom. And we used to think that it was something around 70% which was going to the bottom of the seafloor, but it's 94%. It's quite a high number. So when we see the plastic we see on the beaches, it's around 5% of the plastic which you have in the sea. When you look at this figure, it's showing where we have the biggest problem with plastic, because there has not been established systems for recycling and so on, and that is in the east. So that is where we have the biggest problem. And that is also one of the reasons why we have the biggest gyres in the sea in this area between US and Asia. These show these gyres. It is 5 gyres of plastic in the seas, and the Pacific is the biggest one. It is an area of 20 million square kilometers. And one thing you should know is that 80% of the plastic which you find in these gyres, it is related to how people are, having plastic going out into the sea, and is ending up in these gyres of big pieces of plastic, but also microplastic, which is floating in the sea. We are concerned with regard to what's happening in the Arctic, and especially in the Barents Sea. We have indication that there will be a gyres which will develop in this area if we continue with the pollution of the sea of plastic as it is now. This is said to be around 2040. We will see these gyres being developed also in the Barents Sea. With regard to the findings from the Arctic, we see that the amount of plastic on the beaches in Svalbard is increased. But what is different from what you see in the gyres is that 80% is related to fishing industry, which is the main reason for the plastic which we find in the Arctic. Plastic is found in surface water, in pelagic part of the and also on the bottom of the Barents Sea, and also between Greenland and Svalbard on where you have having depth of 2,000 to 2,500 meters. Plastic is found in higher levels in the polar sea ice. It's incorporated into the sea ice, so it's higher than what you see in the water surrounding it. And microplastic is also found in high levels in the surface water on the western coast of Novaya Zemlya and also on the west part of Svalbard. And there are animals which are affected by plastic pollution. This is pictures from Svalbard where I'm working. This is something we see that the seals who are, entangled into strapping bands around the body, which has gone in, and we had to kill these animals because it was suffering a lot. We also see these ghost nets, which are fishermen who have thrown these nets into the sea, and we had 5 guillemots into this net. We also see these reindeers. It's not only the animals living in the sea which are affected. We see also terrestrial species. Every year we have reindeer. We are entangled into the fishing nets by which we found on the beaches. It is also geese which are going into plastic. And we also had a polar bear last year which went into plastic, and that was rescued by us when we came to this area. The number of species which are infected by plastic is increasing. We can see it both with regard to ingestion of plastic, but also getting entangled. And this is just showing that it has been increasing from 100, and now we are more to 700 to 800 species which are affected by plastic pollution. This is showing the entanglement and the species which are entangled into this plastic pollution. I will tell you the story how I got interested in this, and this is the fulmars. It is the species, if you compare to the south, the albatrosses are the species which are really affected by plastic, but in the north, it is the fulmar. This is a species which becomes 60 to 70 years old, and when I did my investigation in the 80s, we saw that it was very few pieces of plastic in the stomach. When I did my studies in 2013, the picture was completely changed. 87% of the birds, they had plastic in the stomach, and some of the individuals, they had up to 200 pieces of plastic in the stomach. If you look at this picture, you can see that it is higher amount of plastic in the southern part, in the North Sea and so on. So when you move north, there is less amount. But we are already passing a level for having an influence on the birds, and we can see that they are really affected, and we can see birds which are dying of plastic pollution also in my area. We are then asking, is this harmful? If you find 0.6 gram of plastic in the fulmar stomach, this is the same amount which I will have in my stomach if I have the same amount. So for sure, it is really affecting the birds. The question we ask, is this the way we want to have it in the future? This is just showing how it is in the Mediterranean when they are going out to fish and so on. They first have to clean out all the plastic, and then they can start to sort out the fish which has been collected. I don't hope we will see this happening in the Barents Sea with the big resources we have there, and therefore it's really important to get international and national agreements with regard to plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you, Geir. I must say, Svalbard is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. I visited there once, and it's an amazing environment. Now I'd like to ask Dr. John Downing to come to the podium with his statement.
Thanks very much. I should say first off that we do have plastics in our waters in Minnesota. We're beginning pilot projects on them. We have a few other really hideous problems that we need to deal with also in Minnesota waters, and I'll concentrate more on those. So I am, I think, the token freshwater guy between my two salty colleagues. Although I do work on I work in oceanography too, but this is, I am director of the Minnesota Sea Grant program, which is a cross-university program, but our main office is on the UMD campus, University of Minnesota Duluth. We also have an office in St. Paul, and what you're seeing on this image is what I hope to be our coastal office coming soon, in which we've just begun a project to renovate it to make sure we have a great place to do the work on the coastal zones, and also we're responsible for the other 17,246 lakes in Minnesota to some degree. Some people say there are only 11,000, but in fact, There are a lot more. Okay, I start out with a big blue ball to say that there's a lot of water on the planet, and it's divided up in different sorts of ways. And what we just heard about were marine systems. But if you look on this, look, you can see my house actually on this. I think you can see my house. It's right about there on Lake Superior. If you look there, there's a lot of blue there too. And what I'm going to do is make the case that we need to be concerned about these water quality problems as well. As was mentioned earlier by Tom, Earth's water, there's a lot of it. But if you look at what's on the continents, it's a very small slice of that pumpkin pie. And if you then divide that up further, take that little tiny slice and divide it up into water on continents, and in frozen and liquid form, it looks like that, and the liquid is in the sort of lighter orange color. If you further divide that liquid water up again into what can be used readily and what cannot, the liquid water, actually the big dark orange bit, is groundwater, and groundwater tends to be renewed very slowly. So the sources of water we use mostly are those that are on the surface, and about half of the surface lakes in the planet are too salty to use for much of anything. Groundwater, I should say, and I'm going to come to this concept a couple of times. Groundwater is abundant, but it's renewed very slowly. At 30 feet, it takes about 10 years to rebuild that groundwater, and at 300 feet, it takes 1,000 years to renew it. So it's more like mining it than it is going for a renewable resource. But in fact, the freshwater that I work on is that little yellowy slice, my shaking hand. I'm really not as nervous as it looks. It's just is that little slice. Now, if you want to understand what this really means in terms of Earth's water, here's maybe a somewhat familiar image to you. If all of the Earth's water is represented by this football field, wondering where that is, not too far away, the world's surface freshwater would be about as wide as your little finger, about a centimeter of that size. So the freshwater is disproportionately important and not very abundant on the planet. This is a cartoon I dreamed up on the way driving home from work one day, trying to get at this question of renewal of water. And one of the things I think about is a bathtub drip, drip, dripping. And if you think about a slow dripping bathtub, it's going about 1 drip per second. And if you calculate that, it takes about 70 days to fill and overflow that bathtub. That would be a residence time of 70 days, or a renewal rate of 70 days. As contrast, if you look at our wonderful Lake Superior, well, actually, the contrast is the average small lake in Minnesota takes about 17 years. So that input into that lake is much slower proportionately than the drip, drip, drip of your bathtub. Lake Superior takes 190 years to renew. So we look at all that water up there, and we think we've got really a lot of it, but we only get 0.5% of that in interest annually, basically. So we use water faster than it's refreshed. We spoil it faster than we use it. And water is Earth's most important strategic resource, as already been discussed by Tom a minute ago. Surface water, freshwater, although I know that we're supposed to be talking about peace here, but it's been a source of conflict, military conflict, and others since about 3000 BC. So it's been used as a military tool. It's been used as a military target. Resources are destroyed and fouled. All kinds of charming ways of using water for coercive reasons, used in terrorism, even recently, and I'll show you a graph on that in a second. It's used in development disputes, a source of dispute or fighting among nations. And there's a nice, if you're interested in this history, there's a book by Peter Glick that talks about all these conflicts that have taken place in the world. Here are a couple of colorful examples. In 2500 BC, this is Urlama King, I'm sure you all know this of this king. Urlama King of Lagash diverted water to boundary canals to dry up the water supply of Umma, which is actually down at the end of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so you're probably familiar with that area. And we can move forward, and there are lots and lots of these. Leonardo, our friend Leonardo da Vinci, and Machiavelli, maybe that's where the Machiavellian thing came from, planned to divert the Arno River away from Pisa during conflict between Florence and Pisa. It's been used a lot. The British used this in 1777 during the Revolutionary War, attacked the New York waterworks, and there are lots of other things that include contamination, diversion, poisoning, and other charming approaches to attacking people's most strategic resource. This is a graph showing the growth of using water as a weapon of war, and there's a website down at the bottom, you can look that up, but it's increasing rapidly as water becomes rarer and as conflicts become greater. So fresh water is a tool of conflict. It's because it's such a strategic resource. Now, plastics are important. We see them in Lake Superior. We see them in lakes in Minnesota. But in fact, when you ask scientists who work on fresh waters what the most important problems are, they will tell you that the number one problem is water pollution with fertilizer, sewage, and other things, which is called eutrophication. Also, aquatic invasive species like the zebra mussel are changing systems really fast. Hydrology is changing rapidly due to human effects and also climate. Habitat of really important species is being destroyed. Climate change is affecting water supply and quality greatly. In fact, a lot of freshwaters will become salty in coming decades because of climate change. And novel chemicals, in which my colleague from Norway is an expert, we're getting more and more of them in the environment. It may stun you to learn, and Geir just told me before that there are 140,000 different chemical substances released into the environment so far, and they're growing at 2,000 per year. Loss biodiversity is a problem due to extirpation of species. Water quality, demand, and management is another big problem. Overexploitation, overuse, another problem. And agricultural impact is huge. Then I asked water scientists what they think in 20 years our important problems will be in fresh water. And depressingly, they said they'd be almost the same. They didn't think we'd make any progress. Hardly at all. Eutrophication will still be a huge problem. Aquatic invasives will be a huge problem. But we'll maybe be looking at global biotic homogenization. Agricultural impact will rise and so on. You can see the list of things that people like me are concerned about in order to make sure that our strategic water supply is assured. So what does the future hold? How much will water pollution change? There's a really interesting paper that came out in one of the journals of the American Chemical Society, Environmental Science and Technology, by a guy named Stoddard who works for the Environmental Protection Agency. They test lakes across the United States. All those little yellow dots are lakes that are tested in this random analysis of lakes, and they tested them in 2007 and again in 2012 in exactly the same fashion, and they found that the number of eutrophic or nutrient-polluted lakes had gone from 40% of the lakes in the United States to 60%. So eutrophication is changing fast. I wanted to know what we could predict for the near and far future for water quality problems. If we keep up doing the same things we're doing now, and this is a big table you can't read, but I'll cut to the chase here. There are actually five main things that are going to affect how much eutrophication we get. One is population growth driving nutrients into our waters, causing big water quality problems. And the other is we've got them warming. We have lakes getting more lake surface area around agricultural areas. You know, it takes water and nutrients to grow crops. And also we've got warming, which makes algae grow faster. And we also have more hypoxia or sort of dead zones, even within lakes, which we have quite a lot of in Minnesota. So here's sort of the bottom line on this. So here's what to look forward to. Basically, we can expect by 2050, if we keep up doing things as we are, 1 3/4 times to 3 times the nutrient abundance or eutrophic systems on the planet. And I think we're already seeing some forecast of that in what we're seeing in the United States National Lake Assessment. If you move ahead to 2100, we'll be looking at a 3-fold to 6-fold increase in eutrophication in fresh waters, which is the principal water quality problem that we face in the world's most strategic resource, as far as I see it. So it's growing fast, and I'm being really depressing, sorry. I'll try to be better. Okay, here we go. Water problems are worsening, and this is someone I met at Speaker's Corner in London. It's going to get worse. I asked him what's going to get worse. He said, oh, pretty much everything. But there are obvious ways to fix them. Clearly, this is not a best management practice to put your outhouse out in the middle of a lake. So we can fix them. We know how. There's lots of technology to do that. A few takeaways. We use and spoil Earth's usable water faster than it's renewed. Conflict over water is increasing as good water becomes scarcer. Population is the main driver of water quality decline in freshwaters. Fertilizer and sewage pollution linked to population are the biggest problems. Three main things impact water, and that is eating, excreting, and reproducing more people who eat and excrete, which drives pollution up. Pollution of water will increase by 2 to 3-fold by 2050 if we do things the same way, and 3 to 6 times by 2100. But the solutions are linked to just basically good and conscientious housekeeping and resource use, so we can do this. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And now I'd like to welcome Nancy Wallace from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Nancy.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here tonight, and thank you for coming and spending your evening to talk about these issues. I really appreciate it. So I am the director of the Marine Debris Program at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a big title, but we work on this issue every day, and we are the federal lead authorized by Congress for the United States government to work on this. Find the clicker. So, I think generally as citizens, we all really strive to make an impact on the world. But unfortunately, one of the biggest impacts that we've seen lately is in the form of marine debris, like in this picture. Once treated as infinite resources, the ocean and our Great Lakes are now overflowing with man-made items that do not belong there. So what are these items? We've already heard a little bit about it. But they're the things you think of, the things like cigarette butts and litter and bottle caps and plastic bags. But it can also be things like lost fishing gear, lost and abandoned derelict fishing gear that can continue to catch and fish and entangle, as we saw. It's abandoned and derelict vessels. People can leave their boats or they get lost in storms. These are a piece of marine debris as well. And it's these tiny, tiny pieces, these microplastics that we're hearing more and more about are also part of marine debris. So it's everything out in the ocean or Great Lakes that shouldn't be there. So from the most remote shorelines to urban centers, like this one, these lost and discarded items pose a threat to human health, to navigational safety, the economy, and of course, our environment. It poses a particularly grave threat to wildlife, as we saw, which can become entangled in derelict fishing nets or other plastic debris. So this is a pike that was entangled in a plastic wrapper from the outside of a Gatorade bottle, cutting into its body as it grew. This duck was affectionately named Ed and became a local celebrity in Calgary, Canada, all the way back in 1990, after it became entangled in plastic six-pack rings. Canadian Fish and Wildlife spent over 2 weeks tracking Ed and trying to remove the plastic from around his head. Ingestion is also a problem and has been documented in more than 800 marine species. So debris can cause an animal's intestines to become blocked or make them feel full. And this Kemp's Ridley sea turtle ingested a balloon. And this is where I will make my public service announcement. So please never release balloons. And tell your friends and families and at schools, they come down somewhere and this is what can happen. Marine debris is a complex global problem with many, many social and economic drivers. And because of this complexity, it really is important that a wide array of solutions be employed by governments, by academic institutions, by non-governmental organizations, and industry globally. Before we generally try to start tackling any problem, we try to learn as much as we can about it. And some of the most difficult questions faced by the marine debris community have to do with the amount, composition, the source of where this debris is coming from. So through projects like our Marine Debris Monitoring Project, as well as many international data collection efforts, institutions and citizen scientists around the world are working to fill these research gaps. And this is our Great Lakes coordinator for the Marine Debris Program on Lake Erie collecting data. So we know continued research is very important, and we need to understand the impacts of this debris and how it moves and how to stop it. But we also know that we can start trying to stop it right now. So the way we can try to make marine debris from ever becoming a threat is by preventing it from entering the ocean in its first place. So changing behaviors is one way to do that. It's a particularly important aspect of prevention. So our program provides funding to implement behavior change projects on the ground at the local level across the United States. And these projects target a number of audiences, including students like these, and our hope is to educate and inspire the next generation to create and maintain behaviors that are sustainable, as well as to hopefully teach others, like maybe their parents or their grandparents. We'll see. But I think we all know, despite having all the knowledge, tools, and resources, not all people are going to change their behavior. Sometimes it's just too inconvenient. So that's why policy plays an increasingly important role in preventing marine debris. So policy has been used here in the United States and around the world to address issues such as single-use plastic bags, foodware, packaging, with various degrees of success. In Washington, D.C., which is where I live and where this picture was taken, a 5-cent levy on single-use plastic and paper bags has been implemented to both prevent these environmental hazards while financing programs like the Anacostia River Cleanup and Protection Fund. So obviously from this picture, we still have a lot of work to do, but you will notice there's not too many plastic bags there, so maybe that's working. Next thing we have to tackle is beverage bottles. In 2014, Illinois became the first state to institute legislation banning the manufacture and sale of personal care products like face washes and toothpaste that contain plastic microbeads. Many of you may not know, but certain products we use all the time have plastic in them. So Illinois was really the first state to say, we don't want that anymore. So in this particular picture, researchers in Wisconsin are using the flow of a river to sample for microplastics of all kinds, including fragments, microbeads, and microfibers, which we're learning a lot more about. The legislation that was passed in Illinois was such a success that it actually became the model for federal legislation across the United States. And Congress in 2015 passed the Microbeads Act, which banned the manufacture and sale of microbeads in personal care cosmetics. So that is a success story of how one state can really make a difference. Another good example is in Michigan. The Michigan Beverage Container Act has been in place since the 1970s. This bill instituted a 10-cent deposit on cans and items like for pop and beer, which is the highest deposit in the United States. The law was originally instituted to try to stop roadside litter, but it really worked. In Michigan, residents can turn in their bottles and cans at almost any grocery store, and it's resulted in a 95 to 98% recycling rate. So again, another success story. But we know that you have behavior change and you have policy, but there can still be marine debris. So waste management offers a myriad of solutions to fill the gaps where other prevention methods may fail. Infrastructure can act as a last defense before marine debris enters waterways and the ocean. It's clear that when it comes to waste management, every country faces different challenges, and one size definitely does not fit all. So we have to develop solutions that work and take into account local knowledge and gaps, challenges, and financing issues. So this can be seen in the United States. This is actually in Southern California. It's right on the Tijuana, Mexico, and US border. The Pacific Ocean is about 100 yards from where that picture was taken. And when it rains, the rains flow down the mountains, bring all that trash down, and that whole area is covered in water. But something simple like that boom can really protect a lot of trash from going into the ocean. And then in other areas, you need more complex waste infrastructure, like this full stormwater discharge system. We really have to work with what works in each individual place. Oh, that's my last, there we go. The problem of marine debris definitely can feel overwhelming, especially if you live in a place like Jakarta, where this picture was taken. And as you can see, that river is now clean, but once used to look like that. I think that's another success story. So whether you live there in Jakarta or here in the land of 10,000 lakes, marine debris definitely touches everyone. But the good part about that is that it means we can also play a role in the solution by lending a hand to create significant change. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to our speakers, to Nancy and John and Geir. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn the podium over to Janet Dolan to begin the discussion portion.
Very good. And have the cards been handed out? We're going to start, we'll be handing out cards. Also, I've gotten many questions on the back of the program, so apparently it's not a lifelong lifesaver for people. So use whatever you feel free to send up questions on. I'm going to begin with you, Geir. And I do want to say to our audience, if you were just feeling sorry for yourself at how dark it is tonight, I just wanted to tell you that I had a call with Geir maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning here, and it was 6 o'clock up in the Arctic Circle, or 2 o'clock in the afternoon up in the Arctic Circle where he is. And somehow it came out that the sun had just set. And he said, well, in about 2 weeks, the sun will set, and then it won't come back up for 2 months. So I said, well, this is a good time of the year for you to come to Minnesota. You're going to really enjoy the sunshine. So it's easy to feel sorry for yourself till you meet somebody who has it worse. So, but we're glad you're there doing all your good work. So I think John said that his was a bit of a downer, and I guess the whole topic is a little bit of a downer, but my first question is probably going to be the real downer, and it is for you, Geir. You work in this field so extensively. We are going to try to send everybody out with a little bit of optimism by the end, but just how bad is the situation? That is, are any kind of researchers putting any sort of time limits, like, you know, if we don't do something in 10 years or 50 years, there'll be no fishing industry, you won't be eating any wild-caught anything anymore. You can just name a number of animals that will be extinct or at least so endangered that you'll see very few of them. I mean, what are we looking at here in terms of the framing of you know, how serious it is and how soon we need to do things before it's too late?
It has been a great change, you know, during the last 5-10 years with regard to plastic pollution in my area and so on. And what we have done now is we have an initiative, you know, to work with the fishermen so they can see, you know, what's going on and so on. And we have fishermen both from Iceland, from Faroe Island, from Russia, and from Norway getting up to Svalbard to see, you know, what we are seeing. And they are shocked in a way what they have seen. So there is now an initiative that they should work together, and they should be also able to deliver, you know, the kind of things which has been damaged to the harbors. There are initiatives, you know, to improvement of not throwing it to the sea, but take it back to harbors and so on. And this is really good. We also are working, you know, on other issue with trying to have plastic boats, you know, putting a kind of what you call the same as you have on bottles, you know, that there are recycling system also for that being established. And there are many good things happening. And there is so much also initiative among people in order to do things. We see that in Norway there is something around 20 to 30,000 people who are involved in cleaning our beaches every year and so on. And the young generation is really interested in this and so on. So there are many good things which are happening, which I hope we will not see, you know, that the Barents Sea will develop for this 6 gyres as, you know, proposed by scientists and so on.
But are we talking about well, I just had a birthday, but I'm not going to tell you which one. But are we talking about dire consequences in our generation? Are we talking about our children or grandchildren's generation? I'm just trying to get a frame of reference.
I think that my grandchildren, they will see, you know, that this will develop, you know, in the way we. But there is what I have a hope now. There is a very important meeting in Nairobi, which is happening now in December, and all countries are coming to this meeting with new initiatives in order to start to reduce the plastic waste to the ocean. And I tell you, it's a lot to do in Asia. We need to get recycling established in Asia, and this will be very important with regard to reduction of plastic waste to the ocean. But one thing which I'm very, what we see in Norway, we have looked into fish species which are harvested from the Barents Sea. and they find plastic. But when you come to towns, bigger towns, then you find high amount of plastic, up to 30% in some places. But out at sea, it's not so much plastic found still. And we can see on the beaches in Norway, start to level out also on the plastic being found on beaches. So there are things happening, but I think that my grandchildren, they will still see that this will happen and so on.
John, as I said, you were pretty much of a Debbie Downer in your presentation, but presumably it was necessary to get our attention. But when you put it in terms of just what a narrow slice of the real water there is that we're talking about, you did a very good job of describing the 10 worst things that are happening and everything. But what's your prognosis in terms of, is it already too late, or do you think we'll be able to turn the arc when you've got just such a small amount to work with and such a rapid increase in terms of the slope of the line you're showing is pretty steep?
Yes, sorry, I'm usually pretty upbeat, but and I am really in this case too. After all, I did work 20 years in Iowa, and now I'm in Minnesota, so that's a help. And I was born in Iowa, so I can take full credit for that. Whatever. But so I would say we have a series of things happening that we can do a lot about. Phosphorus is our main problem in freshwater. Nitrogen is our main problem in marine systems, and we use both of them on our lawns, and we use both of them in growing lots and lots of food. As population increases, we need to grow more food, or we have to get people to eat in a different way so it doesn't cause quite so much pressure on agriculture where production rates have to go really high. The other thing we have going on the planet right now is that the amount of fresh water is changing at different latitudes. So fresh water is increasing, but fresh water and agriculture will always be pretty much lockstep because you need water and pretty warm weather to grow crops. So we'll see in Minnesota, for example, agriculture going farther and farther north, even though it was not so abundant recently. And I think if we pay attention to, the farmers are really great at using best management practices. They know how to do it. Sometimes it isn't very economically feasible for them because they've got to hit the highest yields at the highest times. Maybe socially and politically we can help them in that regard. I think also if we eat in different ways and change food demand, we can alter how much nutrient has to be applied and stuff like that. So there's lots of hope in this. It's just that if we run as we're going now, the situation is going to be pretty dire. And we don't renew. We look at this a huge amount of water. Every morning I wake up, I look at Lake Superior. It's gigantic, but 0.5% of it is all that we really can use on a sustained basis. So I think we need to meter our expectations to fit the actual resiliency of the planet. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but it does take political and social will to do it.
Well, before I turn it over to the audience in a few minutes, I'm going to ask each of you some specific things that can be done, so hold that thought. Nancy, I'm going to ask you something, but I would invite in for any of the questions, if any of the panelists want to jump in, do. But you laid out two pretty clear options. One is trying to stop the creation of marine pollution in the first place, which, or try to catch it before it gets to the ocean, sort of the stop and recycle type. We all know trying to change behavior is very difficult. Which of those do you think, and also in freshwater or in the marine area also, which of those do you think is most likely? Is it better to just try to be draconian and get plastics out of the food chain, or is it more realistic to say we're much better off putting much more effort into just stopping everything we can from getting there? What do you think in terms of that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a multi-pronged solution, if you will. So I think in some areas, policy really does work, and a lot of the policies happen at the very local level, the city or state level, and I think that's where you can have some really strong impact, especially because you generally will know your stakeholders there and what will work and what may not work. I think behavior change is important and it's happening. I mean, even in just the last decade, I think the amount of people that are bringing reusable bags to the grocery stores has really gone up. I think plastic is part of our lives, so I don't think it's realistic to say that it's going to go away and we should just stop making plastic. But I think what we can all do as individuals is say, do I need that particular piece of plastic? Do I need that shopping bag? Do I need that water bottle? Do I need that straw? You know, is it worth it for those 3 or 4 or 5 minutes I'm going to use it versus the hundreds of years, honestly, it will take to break down? So I think behavior change, if we really can do it, I think there can be a big impact, because marine debris is just the culmination of everyone's individual choices. So if everybody made a choice to make a different choice, we could really have an impact. That being said, sometimes, as I said, not everyone's going to change their behavior, so that's where policy really can help. Like that Microbead Act that passed, I mean, that was really great that the government stepped in and did that, because now manufacturers can't make those products anymore, and we don't need them.
Geir, speaking of microbeads, in preparing for tonight, I was really surprised. Each of you has mentioned them. I think all of us, when we think of plastic in the water, we think of, you know, islands the size of Rhode Island made up of plastic bags, and we've all seen that. But I was really surprised at the level of pollution that also involves these micro pollutants that you can't see. They're probably going to be pretty hard to capture, and just all the kinds of things. So would you explain to the audience a little bit more about what impact they have? And one thing I know everyone here is, especially after all the turkey and dressing from last week, everybody's going to want to eat fish this week. What's the risk we have of eating ocean fish even now? And would you also comment on farm raised? I mean, is it really an alternative, or is that even worse than not eating at all? I mean, that whole food industry thing with the
microbeads, there is something like 9 billion pieces of microbeads going to the marine system every day. Think about that. That's a lot. I think it's 30 fields, tennis fields, you know, covered with plastic, which are going. These are so small, and they are so small that they can be, you know, picked up by the small organisms which you find in the marine system. And these small organisms is being eaten by species higher up, and therefore it's being accumulated, you know, up into the food chain. These plastic particles, they are being produced and they are using additives as in the production of plastic. But what is also happening is that plastic also attracts contaminants which are in the water. So therefore there is higher loading of these chemicals, which are then going into animals, and then this can go into the meat, and this can then be transported up to the food chain. There are very few investigations which has looked into, you know, how much chemicals are being found in these animals and how are they affected by this. But that is my field which I'm working with. I'm very interested to see, like the fulmars, are these compounds which are in the plastic being distributed into the tissue of the fulmars, and is these having an influence on the hormone system of the animals? And we see that it is what we call endocrine disruptors chemicals, which are in plastic, which are affecting the reproduction and also thyroid hormone, which you need to stay warm in the Arctic and so on. So with the fish, you know, is it really affecting us? With the levels we have in the fish now, at least in the Barents Sea, we don't think that this is influencing, you know, the meat and so on. But what is the biggest problem with this is that if there are fish which are more fatty, then you will see that these chemicals will move into the fatty tissues, and then it can start to have influence. So some of the species which you have in the Mediterranean, they are probably affected by that. But European Research Council, they have no projects to look into if fish and so on are affected. There is only one study today which shows that you have these chemicals which may affect, and that is from blue mussels farms. And they have shown that it's going into the tissue, and you may have it on your table.
So would you eat fish, wild caught?
Yes,
Okay, all
eat
right.
fish. Yeah, but with regard to farms and farm fish, it is that the oil they have used in the, you know, the food for the fish, it used to be oil which was contaminated. But what they do now, they clean the oil, so now it is served without contaminants. So that is an improvement, but that has been a cost for the fishing industry.
Okay. John, we're going to turn the corner now and move to optimism. So just want to lay the foundation. And part of that is because you and I talked before, as we prepared for this program, you were actually fairly upbeat and optimistic, even on the regulation side, that Congress and other parties can work together. And you were talking about your Sea Grant program. So would you just briefly talk about what the Sea Grant program is, what it's trying to do for the whole country, and then a little in terms of what the future is of it that you think might help? This is freshwater in the United States.
Well, actually, tons. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I'm obviously thrilled to talk about it. Sea Grant actually is 33 different programs around the United States, and they're in universities, all of them. And it's Sea Grant, and when you think Sea Grant, it doesn't say much to you, right? But land grant, it's a parallel with land grant, essentially. So we're supposed to be doing the same kinds of things that we do in our great land grant universities. University of Minnesota is a Sea Grant and land grant university. So our job basically is to find the science that business, industry, people need, having to do with water, and get it to them in a form that's packaged that they can use. And if the science doesn't exist, then we give out money to university scientists to try to get that science built for the people who really need it. In fact, we have some science that's been proposed on microplastics from Minnesota lakes, and we're trying to find the money to fund it. The concern there is those little particles that we're seeing in Minnesota lakes are just about the same size as algae cells that are eaten by the little animals that the fish eat. And they're also adsorbing chemicals, as Geir says. So we're concerned about that, and also concerned about what's going on in Lake Superior too, which is changing. I've had ample opportunity to talk to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle over the last year, basically because the President zero-funded our program, and so I got a chance to talk with people. But I've had really superb support for water. Who doesn't like water? It doesn't matter if I'm in the office of a Republican or a Democrat. They like water, they like fish, don't like invasive species, and they are working hard to enact good policy to support water. And I think somebody said it earlier, that we have no coherent water policy. I think it was Tom said that. Worse than that, we have no coherent science policy in the United States about how to get water science funded. We're trying to do a lot of that, these 33 Sea Grant programs, most of which, by the way, are marine Sea Grants. We're a Sea Grant because we have Lake Superior. But we're getting superb support, I think, from both sides of the aisle. Every member of our congressional delegation in Minnesota is supportive of those kinds of objectives that we've been talking about here tonight. So I think that's really a positive thought. It's something that I was not totally expecting. But who doesn't like water? Who doesn't like fish? Who doesn't like to eat good, safe food? And who doesn't like a clean water supply? There is no industry on this planet who doesn't need good, clean water. So, yeah, I feel great about it.
Good. Well, Nancy, well, yes. Call your congressman. We'll talk about that. Nancy, I'm going to just ask you one question, then I'm going to ask each of the panelists, what are 2 or 3 things everyone here tonight could walk away and start doing? And I got that question from 2 or 3 people from the floor as well. So, but Nancy, I know as a federal employee, you're, it's limited in terms of how much you can comment on politics, but I think most of us here, whatever side of the aisle you're on, feel that a lot of things just don't get done. There's just a lot of disagreement of where to go and how to get there, and therefore we don't go together there. So, but do you see do you see opportunities for either increased federal policy in this area, or are there international treaties among countries that have already been done that we could join? I mean, what do you see in terms of the country doing things that can move it forward? I saw you shaking your head on the Sea Grant, so you too must feel that there's, below the surface, there's perhaps more cooperation than we would think.
I think so, and just to echo what John said, there is real agreement on this issue from both sides of the aisle, and I truly mean that. Nobody wants trash the ocean. Nobody wants trash in the Great Lakes. And so in Congress, there is real support on both sides. So for example, the Senate introduced a bill this year. It's called the Save Our Seas Act, and it's all about marine debris, and it's reauthorizing our program. It's about working more internationally to address this issue, especially in Southeast Asia. And they had a hearing, and both sides spoke passionately about the issue. That bill passed the Senate unanimously, right? So that is incredibly wonderful. And there's a companion bill in the House. Now, the House of Representatives moves a little slower, and it's still kind of moving through the system, but we're really hopeful that that bill will pass this year. So, and it was interesting because Senator Sullivan from Alaska is a Republican, and Senator Peters from Michigan, who's a Democrat, both spoke about how it's such a bipartisan issue and they're working so well together on the issue, and you don't hear about that. It doesn't get the publicity as so many other things do. It's more interesting to hear about conflict, but it is happening, so I can at least say that. You know, there's a lot of work we have to do, but having that support has been really nice.
Okay, good. Okay, well, as previewed, I would like to, and I'll begin with you, John, and just go down the row. What are 2 or 3 things that you think an individual can do to try to have an impact, at least in their particular sphere of influence? What are 2 or 3 things that you would urge people to do differently, or more of, either one? I mean,
well, I don't think we want to give me an open slate here, because I would just go on for a while, but you know, it sounds really old school, but if you really care about fresh water, which I think most of us do, if you fertilize your lawn, don't use phosphorus. And it sounds really old-fashioned, but man, it makes a big difference. Acre for acre, suburban lawns give off a lot more nutrients than a farmer's field does. It's just we got a lot of farmers' fields. Eat a little bit lower on the food chain would be a good thing to do, because you know, to produce a pound of chicken costs about, I think it's about 1/6 the amount of phosphorus pollution that a pound of beef does. Pay attention. You know, there are people who are advocating changing your diet basically in order to save water. You know, these things about water use, you just be conscious that when you're using water and you think we've got a lot of water and Minnesota, we don't really have to worry about it. There are a couple of things about that are problematic. One of them is that water is renewed really slowly, much slower than you might think. That water takes energy to pump, a lot of energy, and when you run it down your drain, it also takes energy to treat, and so it's enormously costly. So be careful of water use, even though we seem to be relatively rich. I think the idea that it takes 17 years to renew the lakes of Minnesota is a little sobering, and be conscious of that even though it looks like we have a lot of water, we live in a northern climate where that water is renewed relatively slowly. I think those are my 3 things, but I could do a page, but...
I think, you know, these 4 R's, which are so nice, you know. Refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. These are important and should be remembered, whatever you are dealing with plastic. So reduce single-use plastic, you know, avoid microbeads products and so on. And spread the word. Spread the word. That's important.
I had an excellent answer planned, and
they took it.
He just took it. But I will say, in the United States, we generate more waste than any other country, and we don't need to. So I was going to talk about the 4 R's, but I will just say, really think about what you need. Do you need that straw when you go out to dinner? I've already mentioned, please don't release balloons. That's just a personal pet peeve of mine. And especially, water bottles. Just think about, can you bring your reusable water? Can you bring your reusable bag? It sounds so quaint and simple, but it really is simple, and it really can have a big impact.
Okay.
One thing which is happening now in Norway is many universities and the young people, they are going out to the university and trying to be, plastic-free university. And that is something which is really have worked at many places.
Well, speaking of that, I'm going to turn to the questions from our audience. And as I said, there were several of them on what can I do? So we've really already started. And, you know, as often happens, we care the most about what's closest to us. So there are several questions about Minnesota, so I'll try to spread them around. But one of them is a pretty straightforward question, and I'm sure it's on everybody's mind. Are there any alternatives to plastic? I mean, I think we all remember the one-liner from The Graduate, you know, go into plastics, son. Are there alternatives? Does science have an answer for an alternative to plastics in manufacturing and packaging and everything?
There are many alternative products and so on, and I think they're on the web page. There are different products which are shown, which are alternatives and so on. But it's also interesting, you know, they are also working with new technologies, using more of biological products in a way of making things which, like I heard about an American group who have started, you know, you use this for six-packs. You know, that you put that on, this kind of thing, which has really had been a problem for many animals. And this can be dissolved in water. When it gets into water, it's dissolved and can be eaten by fish, which is made by mice.
It's the beer product.
Yeah,
after you,
that's right.
I'm not a brewer, but after the leftover beer product, they're making it into six-pack rings now.
Okay. So recycled products, basically making something, and then biodegradable.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and just to make a note on biodegradable, that is something we actually have to be pretty careful about, because a lot of biodegradable plastics only degrade in very certain conditions, and they may not break down, in most cases don't break down to their full organic compounds. And so what can actually happen with a biodegradable product, it can just break down into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic that then can be ingested. So that's something to just really think about. Biodegradable doesn't mean you can just litter it or it's free to use more of.
Actually, I wanted to say that is the replacing plastic is the main theme of the journal Science for this week. And I picked it up as I was leaving my office. And because I was driving down here, I didn't get a chance to read it. But that's basically what they're looking at.
Okay, so you're going to promote Science Magazine to the entire audience?
No.
Very good
I don't know
marketing.
the answers, but people are searching for the answers, what I want to say.
That's great. Well, John, this is a question for you. And it says, we in Minnesota, I'm sure it's true of all the states, but we just hear about it more here. We are already seeing local communities fight over groundwater. And the White Bear Lake, for those of you who don't know, it's a question of lakes that are close enough to the metropolitan area, so they're really where people live and have their homes, are going up and down depending upon how much groundwater is used. And so the question is, what's the future of these conflicts over water tables and fresh water among communities?
Yeah, I have said a bunch of times that I think the least understood water resource in Minnesota is groundwater. We have very little data on it, and I think we need to get the data that we need in order to understand how fast it's renewed. It's not like falling off a turnip truck. You know, it's hard to get those kinds of data, and you know, we think because it's below the soil and we don't see it, that it's somehow infinite and can go on and on forever. In a place where you have White Bear Lake drying up and a lake up near Coleraine, Minnesota that's overflowing, you know that there's something going on with groundwater in the state of Minnesota. So, and I know the governor's office is on board with finding ways to find out a lot more about the groundwater resource. The rate of renewal of groundwater is pathetically slow, and so you don't want to pull it out too fast. You're mining it, basically. You're not using it as a renewable resource. So understanding how fast it's renewed, and don't get the pumping rates so high that they draw down the groundwater. My geologist friends say lakes are just an outcropping of the groundwater. They really aren't anything other than a place where the groundwater sticks out of the ground.
Came out of the ground.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so. Nancy, I don't know if you can comment on this, but I think you'd be in the best position. I've gotten a couple of different comments, and basically they're saying, you know, with the pipeline issue in North Dakota, Minnesota, we happen to have a question about mining in the boundary waters, and just a number, but these public protests that are drawing protesters from around the country, while they may be about oil or other minerals right now, is joining in those public protests, does that help raise public awareness of water? Are any people starting to make the connection? So I guess it's sort of is that something people should be thinking about doing too, is just trying to become much more engaged in these public issues so that we start talking about resources, period.
Yeah, I mean, I think becoming more engaged in the issue is very important. I think being positive and proactive about how you do that is important, but raising awareness, having conversations with your local officials, with your elected representatives, really does make an impact, so I think whatever you can do to raise, I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm here tonight talking about this, is raising the issue, raising awareness can really make a change, because really, when I go to Congress and go up to the Hill, I like to think they're listening to me, but they're really listening to you. They want to hear from you. They want to know what you're thinking. And so I think that's really the best way, working with local, state, federal elected representatives to just say, this matters to me. That's what they're there for. They're there to represent you.
This may be, is Tom, you may end up answering this one, because this is a good question. I just don't know who wants to jump in. And I hope I can read the writing. This goes to water rights may lead to conflicts. If the waters of I think it's the Maret River that rises in Turkey prior to moving on to the Euphrates, or if Turkey were to build a dam, what would happen to the river to Syria and Iraq? So on an international level, what right does any one country have to dam up a river in their world, in their country, that's going to have downstream? So do any of you want to take a crack at this, or else, Tom?
Well, we're shy on international attorneys up here, but and it is really a big legal issue, and there's a lot of water law written into international law. So World Bank has been involved in a lot of that. And I think the important part to me of that question is that we sometimes forget that we're upstream of somebody else. And so we do something and it has an effect on everybody downstream. I ran into that a lot in Iowa, where people would call me and say, the river just cut my field in half, and that's no good. And I said, well, do you have tile drains? You probably cut somebody's field in half downstream. We'd forget about the upstream downstream thing. The law, I don't know. Tom, do you?
Yeah. This is one of these, gray areas, but that ultimately comes under the heading of national sovereignty. It's estimated there are 260 river systems in the world that cross international boundaries, where potentially you could have conflict. The one in Turkey is a very good example. One of the most, I think, important involves the Tibetan Plateau, where most of the major river systems of Asia and South Asia have their origin, and that is Chinese. And already the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, some of the rivers in India are experiencing lesser flows because of Chinese engineering and without recourse. So although there's a lot of international law on this, ultimately it comes down to national sovereignty and control of territory. As I say, with that many river systems potentially under dispute, this could be a source of major conflict later in the century.
Just having returned from China, I would say it might be connecting the dots. There's a lot of concern about how many Chinese citizens are being moved into Tibet to dilute the Tibetan population's control over their own. And anyway, so these kind of big decisions might be linked. There may be reasons for doing that. That may be one of the reasons for doing it. That's very important. Right.
Janet, can I say one really positive thing? I know you'd like me to say something
you're the
positive.
Source of positive here.
So the Great Lakes, you may realize we share that with Canada, and other sovereign nations and First Nations and various Native American groups. But I would say, with respect to the Great Lakes, there is terrific cooperation on this essential water resource. The Great Lakes drive an economy. If you took the provinces and states around the Great Lakes, it'd be the third largest world economy, and it's just based on water and transport. So cooperation has been terrific through the International Joint Commission and the Great Lakes Commission and so on. So there's a place where that's really working.
We end promptly at 8:30, and so I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. And this one I think could go to anyone, but it's probably going to be John, because it is a question about irrigation. And it says, would you comment on irrigation in farming? Is it increasing? It seems to be. And what is it doing to the aquifers? And I guess I would add on to that, just as we sort of talked about, can you build a dam and stop some water from going? Is everybody free to have irrigation if they want to, or are there quantity limits? Are there any efforts to manage the growth of irrigation?
It's really subject to a lot of legal dispute, especially in the western U.S., obviously. And if we know little about surface water, we know even less about groundwater, so it's really hard to guess what we're doing. I think there are really clear examples where groundwater has been drawn down by irrigation substantially, and then the surface water becomes saline because of the really salty because of the really high rates of evaporation. North Dakota tried to do something like this with a series of canals, and I don't know if you've ever seen these canals out there, but the water feels soapy because it's so salty. So, but there are huge disputes that are being waged over groundwater, and hopefully they will get solved in equitable ways. Irrigation is one of the major uses of water that we withdraw, and so, and as climate warms in this region, we'll still expect to grow the same kinds of crops, and so we'll be pulling more water from surface and groundwater.
Well, anybody that travels to California, you certainly hear about the natural waterways all down the eastern side of the state that over 100 years have all been diverted, and it's terrible impact in terms of the amount of water they have. Here's a question, Nancy, I think it probably goes to you. What happens to all the debris that's collected? Like into a landfill, or we burn it and then put the pollution in the air? What do we do with it?
That is an excellent question. So all different types of things happen to it. A lot of it does go into landfills. Sometimes it can be recycled if it's clean enough. It can be recycled. And then there's a lot of really innovative people that are doing interesting things with making products out of the debris that's collected. So there's a company called Method you may have heard of. They do some of their soap bottles out of ocean plastic. Or a great company down in that works out of Chile, Burrio, that makes skateboards and sunglasses. So there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are doing really, really interesting things, and the idea is let's reuse this. Let's not just put it in a landfill. So unfortunately, some does go into landfills, some is converted into waste to energy facilities, so it is incinerated, but then goes back into the electrical grid. So the idea is let's try to reuse, recycle as much as we can to keep it out of landfills.
In Europe, it is a lot of things happening with this circular economy, which is really important, to reuse it. But what is happening in Germany, they were, having a very good established system in this issue. And then what happened was that something around 25% of the plastic went back to China for new production and so on. But what happened was that in China, they didn't want that. So they stopped the whole thing, with circular. So now they are dealing with the kind of problem in Germany, how to use this kind of plastic which has been collected and so on. But there are many initiatives. And in Norway, we see that the nets from fishermen, they are being used in now production of chairs and so on. So there are many things going on with developing on new technology.
Okay. And Geir, I think I'll finish with you. This is a very explicit question. I don't know. How does, or did, the Japanese Fukushima nuclear power plant pollution did it impact groundwater or the ocean? And I would expand that to say nuclear power. Do nuclear power plants have any impact at all? We haven't talked about it at all. I don't know if it does, but obviously because I think we all heard about the air pollution that moved across the world, but was there also pollution of the water that moved across the world? But what about nuclear plants?
We know that nuclear power plants are also having an effect on the water and so on. Like in Sellafield, when they had the technetium, which was, going out into the sea, we saw it in Svalbard 5 to 7 years after in the water and so on. But it took, I think, 10, 15 years before it started to decrease again and so on. So you will see that it has an influence on the water, but the current will determine when this will turn up on your coast.
And I can speak a little to that because we were very engaged with the Japanese government after the tsunami in 2011 from a debris perspective, because so much of the debris washed into the ocean and washed ashore on U.S. and Canadian coastlines. And so there was a lot of studying about the radiation as well. And what we found is no debris had radiation, and the water samples didn't have any measurable, levels. But what was interesting, which maybe a lot of people didn't think about, was the invasive species that traveled with the debris across the ocean and lived for 5-6 years that we're still finding. So the Japanese government actually funded a really robust study where we looked at how many species made it across the Pacific Ocean. And then we're actually monitoring on the coasts of Washington, Oregon, up Alaska and British Columbia, and in Hawaii to see if there's any species that are actually becoming residents there. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a fascinating project that I've been personally working on for the last almost 6 years.
Well, good. I'd like to thank whoever asked that question then. Before we close, I have a question for either Christina or Robin. Are the peace pipes here? I don't see them. Will somebody bring it up? Okay, all right. When I get done with my remarks, you'll know what that means. Well, thank you all very much. It was a very engaging conversation. And I think, first of all, we should all give them a big round of applause. We got halfway there. So I will just explain what we do. We have a tradition for all of our panelists, for all of our programs, and that is as a thank you to each of you for coming. Now, I know, Guy, and you came because of the sunshine, but our other panelists, anyway, for coming, we have a Minnesota peace pipe. And this is our symbol for our Minnesota Peace Initiative, and it is made of pipestone is a natural stone from southwestern Minnesota. And the reason we have this is really twofold. One, the obvious, it is a sign of peace, but also, and it is a sign of our Norwegian roots and our commitment to peacemaking, but also a sign of respect and appreciation to the Native American community and influence in our state of Minnesota. And the peace pipe, as we know, was used in many ways, but it certainly was used frequently as part of the Native American healing process. So that, for all those reasons, we hope you will cherish this as a memory of this evening. And I will spare you the need of explaining to the TSA officer what it is. So we will be glad to mail yours to you and save you any time in Fort Leonard. So anyway, so we appreciate you being here. I also would like to thank our Minnesota Peace Initiative Committee. Their names are on your program. And I would like to give special acknowledgement to Larry Bakken. Larry, will you stand wherever you are? Who chairs the committee. And we have a lot of fun on our committee. And we put a lot of thought and energy into, first of all, picking the topic, and then second of all, finding world experts around the world. So we have a really good time. I enjoy being a part of the committee, and I extend this at every one of our programs. If any of you here who are regularly come to our programs and like them and want to take part, we would love to have anyone join our committee who wants to be a part of future planning, and you can certainly do that by contacting the Norway House. I would also like to thank, especially want to thank Christina for bringing up the pipe, but I'd like to thank Christina Carlton. Christina, are you here? You were right back there. She is the executive director of the Norway House, and as you know, the Minnesota Peace Initiative is part of the Norway House. And Robin Cole is here as well, and she is a staff member. She provides all the support for our committee. I also want to encourage all of you, especially those of you who are part of the Norwegian American community here, but actually everybody. I would like to encourage you. We are building a Norway House, and I encourage all of you who are interested to contribute to it. When we get our Norway House built, our programs will then be at the Norway House. So we've enjoyed our time here at the University of Minnesota, but we are really looking forward to having our own home at the new Norway House. Also, I encourage you to visit the current Norway House, which is on Franklin and 10th. They have a lot of programs, and right now they have a great program, which is their gingerbread house Christmas program, and it's just delightful. And so I encourage anyone who's interested to go. Take any children in your life. They will just thoroughly enjoy it. And you can always go on the website for the Norway House and sign up, and you will get notices of all of the programs, including our own. Is John Pedersen here? He was here earlier. There he is. You can't miss him. He always has a fabulous Norwegian sweater on. John is the chairman of the board of the Norway House, and also a very important role. He is the head of the capital campaign for the Norway House. So if you think you're going to get to your car tonight, you'll have to go by John through the door. So anyway. So let's give, and also there are many members of the Norway House board here too. So I would just like to give the whole Norway House a big round of applause for all their support. And finally, and last, but certainly the most important people here tonight are you, each and every one of you here in our audience. I tried to get around to meet as many of you before the program began as I could. I know, and I'm starting to get to know many of you who are regular attendees at our program, but I know some of you are first-timers, and so we hope you enjoyed it. We hope you will come to future programs. We have a spring program and a fall program, and you can always find out all the information you want on the website for the Norway House. And I can't tell you what the topic for the spring will be, because usually we pick the hottest spot in the world and try to bring you experts on that, and we won't know that for a few more months. So I hope you'll look for that, and you will come to our spring program. We hope to see you there. And I think this might be the nicest evening we've had for our winter program in a long time. Usually I'm saying drive safely and everything, but I'm going to say take your jackets off, walk outside, and enjoy a beautiful evening. I hope everybody has a wonderful Christmas and holiday season, and we hope to see you here next spring. Thank you very much.